The day my mother-in-law humiliated me in front of everyone was supposed to be one of the happiest days of her life. The ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers. Expensive flowers lined every table. Guests laughed and celebrated as my ex-husband's family hosted a lavish engagement party for his younger sister. I almost didn't attend. After all, I had spent the last 2 years rebuilding my life after a painful divorce. But my former sister-in-law Emma had personally invited me. "Please come," she had begged over the phone. "You were always more like a sister than a sister-in-law." So I agreed. I arrived wearing a simple navy blue dress and quietly took a seat near the back. For the first hour, everything seemed peaceful. Then I saw her. Margaret, my former mother-in-law. The woman who had spent years criticizing everything about me. The woman who had convinced her son that I wasn't good enough. The woman who never missed an opportunity to remind me that her family came from money while mine didn't. The moment she spotted me, her smile vanished. I knew that look. Trouble was coming. She marched across the room, attracting attention with every step. Several guests turned to watch. I stood politely. "Margaret," I said. She folded her arms. "I never expected to see you here. Emma invited me." She laughed loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. Of course she did. She always had terrible judgment. An awkward silence followed. I tried to walk away. Then she delivered the sentence that would change everything. "Leaving you was the best decision my son ever made." The room suddenly felt smaller. Several guests froze. Others pretended not to listen. Margaret wasn't finished. "He finally found someone worthy of him." A few people exchanged uncomfortable glances. I felt my heart pounding. Not because her words hurt, but because they reminded me how much I had changed. 2 years ago, I would have cried. 2 years ago, I would have begged for approval. Not anymore. I calmly smiled. "If that helps you sleep at night, Margaret." Her face tightened. She clearly expected tears. Instead, she got confidence. That only made her angrier. "Oh please," she snapped. "Everyone knows you were holding him back." The guests were openly staring now. Emma looked horrified. My ex-husband David stood across the room, watching nervously. Margaret pointed at me. "My son has a better life now." I glanced at David. Oddly enough, he couldn't even meet my eyes. And that was when I noticed something strange. Several people were whispering while looking at me. Not Margaret. Me. One guest even pulled out his phone. Another looked shocked. Margaret mistook their reactions as support. She smiled smugly. "See, everyone agrees." I almost laughed. Because she had absolutely no idea what was about to happen. 5 minutes later, the ballroom doors opened. And everything changed. The grand ballroom doors swung open. At first, nobody paid much attention. People assumed more guests were arriving. Then the room slowly grew quiet. One by one, conversations stopped. Heads turned toward the entrance. A tall man in an expensive charcoal suit stepped inside, followed by 2 assistants. The moment he entered, several business executives near the front immediately stood up. Whispers spread across the room. "Oh my God, is that really him? It can't be." Margaret frowned. She looked confused. Unlike many of the guests, she didn't recognize him. I did. And the second our eyes met, he smiled. Then he started walking directly toward me. The room watched in silence. Margaret's confident expression began to crack. The man stopped in front of me. "Sorry I'm late." I smiled. "No problem." He shook his head. "Actually, it's a huge problem. My future business partner shouldn't have to wait for me." A collective gasp swept through the room. Business partner. Margaret blinked. What? The man turned politely toward her. I'm sorry, have we met? Margaret forced a smile. No, but I'm Margaret Thompson. He nodded politely, then looked back at me. Sarah, the board is waiting for your final decision. More whispers erupted. David suddenly looked pale. Emma looked completely stunned. Margaret laughed nervously. I think there's been some misunderstanding. The man raised an eyebrow. What misunderstanding? Margaret pointed toward me. She's my son's ex-wife. Yes. She doesn't own any company. The man stared at her for several seconds. Then he laughed. Actually laughed. Several guests exchanged confused looks. Margaret's smile disappeared. Did I say something funny? The man folded his arms. Only if you consider calling the founder of a multi-million-dollar company unemployed funny. Silence. Absolute silence. Margaret's face turned white. David looked like he had been punched. The guests stared at me. A few even pulled out their phones. The truth was finally becoming impossible to ignore. 2 years earlier, after my divorce, I had started a small online consulting business from my apartment. Everyone laughed at the idea. Everyone except me. I worked 16-hour days. Weekends. Holidays. Birthdays. Every spare moment. Slowly, clients came. Then more clients. Then investors. Then opportunities. What started as one laptop and a tiny desk had become a thriving company with offices in 3 cities. But I never bragged about it. I never felt the need. Especially not to people who had already decided I was a failure. Margaret looked as if she couldn't process what she was hearing. No. The businessman smiled. Actually, yes. David finally stepped forward. Sarah, why didn't you tell anyone? I looked at him calmly. You never asked. His face fell. Because he knew it was true. After the divorce, nobody from his family had bothered checking on me. Nobody cared how I was doing. Nobody cared whether I succeeded. They had already written my story. The problem was that reality had written a very different ending. Margaret suddenly grabbed David's arm. This isn't possible. But even as she said it, guests around the room were searching my company online. The reactions were immediate. Shock, disbelief, admiration. One woman covered her mouth. Another looked at me with newfound respect. The attention that Margaret had wanted for herself was now focused entirely on me. And she hated every second of it. But what happened next was even worse. Because the businessman wasn't finished speaking. Not even close. He turned toward the crowd and smiled. Ladies and gentlemen, since everyone is here, I might as well share the news. A nervous silence filled the room. He looked directly at me. The acquisition deal was approved this morning. My eyes widened. What? He grinned. It's official. The room held its breath. Then he announced a number so large that several people nearly dropped their drinks. And Margaret's knees almost gave out. For a moment, I genuinely thought I had heard him wrong. The ballroom was so quiet that you could hear glasses clinking in the distance. The businessman smiled. Then he repeated the number. $48 million. A collective gasp echoed through the room. Someone nearly dropped a champagne glass. Another guest whispered, "Did he just say 48 million?" My heart pounded. The acquisition discussions had been happening for months. There had been negotiations, delays, legal reviews, countless meetings. But I hadn't expected the final approval to happen today. And certainly not here. The businessman extended his hand. Congratulations, Sarah. Still stunned, I shook it. The room erupted into whispers. Margaret stood frozen. Her face had gone completely pale. David looked like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. $48 million. The woman his family had mocked. The woman they called a failure. The woman they said would never succeed. Was now worth more than most people in that ballroom combined. And everyone knew it. Margaret opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. For once in her life, she couldn't find words. Emma was the first person to move. She rushed toward me and wrapped her arms around me. "I knew you'd make it," she whispered. Tears filled her eyes. Unlike the others, Emma had always believed in me. Even when nobody else did. I hugged her back. "Thank you." Across the room, David slowly approached. The crowd parted for him. His expression was filled with regret. The kind of regret that arrives years too late. "Sarah." I turned toward him. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally he sighed. "You really did it." I nodded politely. "Yes." His eyes dropped to the floor. Then he laughed bitterly. "You know what's funny?" I waited. "I used to tell myself I'd be happier without you." The room remained silent. Nobody wanted to miss a single word. David swallowed hard. "But the truth is," he looked directly at me, "you were never the problem." Margaret's eyes widened. "David." He ignored her. For years he had listened to his mother's opinions. For years he had allowed her voice to become louder than his own. Now the consequences stood directly in front of him. I made the biggest mistake of my life. A few guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Margaret stepped forward. "David, stop this." But he wasn't listening anymore. Not to her. Not to anyone. Only to the truth. "You supported me when I had nothing." His voice shook slightly. "You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." I remained silent. There was no anger left inside me. No bitterness. Just peace. David smiled sadly. And I threw it all away. Margaret suddenly snapped. "Enough." The room jumped. She pointed at me. "This changes nothing." Everyone stared. Even David looked shocked. Margaret's pride refused to surrender. She couldn't accept reality. "Not yet. Money doesn't make someone special," she said loudly. I actually agreed with that. But before I could respond, one of the older guests spoke up. A respected businessman known throughout the city. "No, Margaret." The room turned toward him. He stood calmly. "Character does." Several guests nodded. The businessman pointed toward me. "And Sarah showed more character in 5 minutes than you've shown all evening." Margaret looked devastated. People who once admired her were openly disagreeing with her now. The social power she had spent decades building was slipping away. And it was happening in front of everyone. Then something unexpected happened. A young woman walked into the ballroom. Beautiful, elegant, confident. She headed straight toward David. The guests immediately recognized her. David's girlfriend. The woman Margaret had always described as the perfect replacement. The woman she claimed was better than me in every way. But the expression on her face wasn't admiration. It was disappointment. Deep disappointment. She stopped in front of David, crossed her arms, and said a sentence that made the entire room freeze. "Is it true?" David frowned. "What's true?" She held up her phone. "I just found out who Sarah really is." His face fell. The woman shook her head. Then she said something nobody expected. "If you could walk away from someone this loyal, this hardworking, and this kind." She paused. "How do I know you won't do the same thing to me someday?" The room went completely silent. David looked speechless. Margaret looked terrified. Because for the first time all night, she realized this wasn't just about losing an argument. Everything she thought she had protected. Her reputation, Her influence, her son's future, was beginning to collapse. And the worst part, the night was far from over. Because moments later, a phone call arrived that would leave Margaret completely shattered. Margaret's phone began ringing. At first, she ignored it. The entire ballroom was watching her. The last thing she wanted was another interruption. But the phone kept ringing. Again, and again, and again. Finally, frustrated, she pulled it from her purse. The moment she saw the caller ID, her expression changed. It was the bank. Margaret quickly stepped aside and answered. "Hello." At first, nobody paid attention. Then her face drained of color. "What do you mean?" The room fell silent. Even from several feet away, people could hear the panic in her voice. "No, that's impossible." She listened. Her hands started shaking. David noticed immediately. "Mom." Margaret ignored him. "How much?" Another pause. Then she nearly dropped the phone. "You're telling me we've lost everything?" Gasps echoed around the room. David rushed toward her. "What happened?" Margaret ended the call with trembling fingers. For several seconds she couldn't speak. Then she looked at her son. "The investment account." David frowned. "What about it?" "It's gone." "What?" "The company collapsed." The room exploded with whispers. Months earlier, Margaret had convinced several family members to invest a large portion of their savings into a guaranteed opportunity. She constantly bragged about it. She claimed it would double their money. She mocked anyone who questioned her judgment, including me, especially me. I remembered warning David years ago. If something sounds too good to be true, it usually is. Back then, Margaret called me ignorant. Now reality was proving otherwise. David looked stunned. "How much did we lose?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Almost all of it." The words hit like a bomb. Several relatives looked horrified, because they had invested too. One uncle immediately pulled out his phone. Another woman covered her mouth. People were suddenly checking their accounts. Panic spread through the ballroom. The glamorous celebration was turning into chaos. And then things became even worse. A gray-haired man stepped forward. Margaret recognized him instantly. Her former business partner. His expression was cold. Very cold. "Margaret." She swallowed nervously. "What?" The man folded his arms. "I think it's time everyone learned the truth." The room quieted again. Margaret looked terrified. "Don't." But he continued. "For years, Sarah wasn't the problem." Guests exchanged confused glances. The man pointed toward me. She was the only person brave enough to tell Margaret when she was wrong. A murmur spread across the crowd. Margaret shook her head. "Stop talking." The man ignored her. "When Sarah warned us about risky investments," Margaret laughed. Several relatives nodded. When Sarah suggested better financial decisions, Margaret dismissed her. More nods. "And when Sarah tried to help this family." He paused. Quote. Margaret made sure nobody listened. The silence became unbearable. David slowly turned toward his mother. "Is that true?" Margaret couldn't answer. Because it was. For years she had cared more about being right than doing what was right. And now everyone could see it. The image she spent decades building was crumbling. Brick by brick. Lie by lie. Excuse by excuse. Then Emma stepped forward. Tears filled her eyes. "I remember." Everyone looked at her. Emma stared directly at her mother. "Sarah helped me pay my college tuition when I was struggling." Gasps filled the room. Margaret looked shocked. "You never told me that." Emma laughed bitterly. "Because I knew you'd be angry." More silence. Then another relative spoke. "And Sarah helped me find a job." A second person nodded. She helped my daughter too. Then another. And another. And another. Suddenly stories started pouring out. Acts of kindness, support, generosity, guidance. The very people Margaret expected to support her were sharing reasons they respected me instead. I stood there speechless. I had never helped people for recognition. Most of these stories had remained private for years. But now they were finally being heard. Margaret looked completely defeated. The room no longer saw the failure she described. They saw the truth. A woman who had quietly helped others while rebuilding her own life. And then David did something nobody expected. He walked directly toward me. The entire ballroom held its breath. His eyes were filled with regret, pain, and realization. Then he said the words that changed everything. "Sarah, would you give me one chance to explain?" The room froze. Because everyone knew exactly what that question meant. And everyone was waiting to hear my answer. The ballroom became so quiet that even the musicians stopped playing. Every eye was on me. David stood a few feet away, waiting. His face showed something I had never seen before. Not pride, not confidence, not arrogance, humility. For the first time in years, he looked like a man who truly understood what he had lost. "Sarah, please," he said softly. "Just let me explain." I looked at him calmly. A part of me remembered the man I had once loved. The man who used to make me laugh. The man who once promised we would face every challenge together. But another part of me remembered the nights I cried myself to sleep. The loneliness. The betrayal. The silence when I needed support the most. I nodded. "You have 5 minutes." The room remained silent. David took a deep breath. Then he finally told the truth. The divorce wasn't Sarah's fault. A wave of whispers spread through the crowd. Margaret immediately stiffened. David looked directly at everyone. For years, I blamed Sarah because it was easier than admitting my own mistakes. Nobody interrupted. Nobody moved. Everyone listened. I let other people make decisions for my marriage. His eyes shifted toward his mother. Margaret looked away. I allowed opinions, criticism, and pressure to come between us. A painful silence followed. Then David said something that shocked everyone. I knew Sarah was right most of the time. Several guests gasped. "What?" Margaret snapped. David ignored her. "She warned me when business deals looked risky." He looked around the room. "She warned me when people were taking advantage of me." His voice grew heavier. "And she warned me when my relationship with my mother was becoming unhealthy." The room froze. Margaret looked horrified. Because deep down, she knew it was true. David sighed. "But instead of listening to my wife, I listened to fear." Nobody spoke. Nobody dared. The truth was finally standing in the center of the room. And it couldn't be ignored anymore. Then David looked at me. "I'm sorry." For a moment, I saw tears in his eyes. Real tears. Not for losing money. Not for losing status. But for losing someone who genuinely loved him. I should have fought for us. I remained silent. Not because I was angry. But because some apologies arrive after the damage is already done. David seemed to understand. He lowered his head. Then something unexpected happened. Margaret suddenly shouted, "Stop blaming me." The room jumped. All eyes turned toward her. She looked desperate, cornered, like someone whose entire world was collapsing. "This family wouldn't exist without me." Nobody responded. Because nobody knew what to say. Margaret pointed at me. "She's manipulating all of you." The accusation hung in the air. Then an older woman slowly stood up. It was David's grandmother. A woman everyone respected. A woman who rarely spoke during family disputes. When she spoke, people listened. And tonight was no exception. That's enough, Margaret. The room froze. Margaret looked stunned. Mother. The elderly woman shook her head sadly. I should have spoken years ago. A feeling of tension spread through the ballroom. Something important was coming. Something big. The grandmother looked around the room. Then she revealed a secret she had kept for years. Sarah wasn't the first woman Margaret pushed away. Gasps erupted everywhere. Margaret's face turned white. Mother, don't. But it was too late. The truth had started coming out. The grandmother continued. 25 years ago, Margaret interfered in her brother's marriage too. The room fell silent. Nobody had heard this story before. She convinced him that his wife wasn't good enough. People stared. That marriage ended in divorce. Another gasp. The grandmother's voice trembled. And he regretted it for the rest of his life. Margaret looked completely shattered. Years of hidden mistakes. Years of control. Years of manipulation. Were finally being exposed. One by one. Right in front of everyone. The guests no longer looked at her with admiration. They looked at her with disappointment. The realization hit Margaret like a wave. This wasn't about money anymore. It wasn't about status. It wasn't even about being embarrassed. For the first time in her life, she was being forced to face the consequences of her actions. And that terrified her. Then she did something nobody expected. Her eyes filled with tears. She looked at me, not with anger, not with superiority, but with regret, genuine regret. Sarah. The room held its breath. Her voice broke. I'm sorry. A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. Margaret Thompson had never apologized to anyone. Not once. Yet here she was, standing in front of everyone, admitting she was wrong. But the biggest surprise of the night was still waiting. Because seconds later, I reached into my purse, pulled out a sealed envelope, and placed it on the table. David frowned. Margaret stared. What is that? She whispered. I looked at them both. Then smiled. It's something I planned to give you before tonight began. Nobody in the room could have guessed what was inside. And when the envelope was opened, the entire family would be left speechless. The envelope sat on the table. For several seconds, nobody moved. The entire ballroom seemed frozen in time. Margaret stared at it nervously. David looked equally confused. Finally, Emma stepped forward. Sarah, what's inside? I smiled softly. Open it. Margaret hesitated. Her hands were still trembling. Slowly, she picked up the envelope and removed the documents inside. The moment she saw the first page, her eyes widened. What? David leaned closer. His expression instantly changed. The room waited. Nobody understood what they were looking at. Then David whispered, "This can't be real." I nodded. It is. The documents showed something nobody expected. Months earlier, when I learned about the risky investment Margaret had convinced the family to join, I quietly started investigating. The numbers didn't make sense. The promises were unrealistic. The entire project looked dangerous. I knew disaster was coming. And despite everything that had happened between us, I couldn't ignore it. So I acted. Before the investment company collapsed, I purchased a portion of the remaining assets through one of my firms. Not for profit, not for revenge, but to protect innocent people who would be hurt, including members of David's family. The paperwork in the envelope proved it. David looked stunned. You bought the assets? Yes. Margaret slowly sat down. Her legs could barely support her. What does that mean? I took a deep breath. It means the family isn't going to lose everything. The room exploded with shock. Several relatives covered their mouths. Others stared at me in disbelief. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "You saved us." I nodded, as much as I could. For a moment, nobody spoke. The same woman Margaret had mocked only hours earlier. The same woman she called a mistake. Had quietly protected the family from financial ruin. Even after everything, the realization hit everyone at once. Character, integrity, kindness. Those things couldn't be bought. And Sarah had them in abundance. Margaret suddenly broke down crying. Not polite tears. Not controlled tears. Real tears. The kind that come from years of regret. "I don't deserve this." The room remained silent, because for the first time all evening, nobody disagreed. But I wasn't helping because she deserved it. I was helping because that was who I chose to be. Margaret looked at me. "I spent years trying to prove you weren't good enough." Her voice cracked. "And all you did was prove how wrong I was." Tears streamed down her face. The ballroom grew emotional. Even guests who barely knew the story were wiping away tears. Then David stepped closer. His eyes were red. "I don't expect forgiveness. I appreciated his honesty. I know. I don't expect another chance." Again, I nodded. "I know." He smiled sadly. "But I hope someday you'll remember me for more than my worst mistakes." For the first time that night, I smiled warmly. "I already do." David lowered his head. Relief washed over his face. Not because he had won me back, but because he had finally told the truth. And truth has a way of setting people free. Then Emma hugged me again. Soon other relatives joined, one by one. The atmosphere that had begun with humiliation was ending with healing. But there was one final question. A guest finally asked it. "Sarah, what happens now?" I looked around the room. At the family. At the people who once doubted me. At the people who now saw me differently. Then I answered. "Tomorrow, I continue building the life I worked for." The guest smiled. "And David?" I glanced toward him, then shook my head gently. "Some chapters teach us important lessons." The room waited. "But that doesn't mean they should be rewritten." David smiled sadly. Yet he understood. Some opportunities only come once. And he had already let his go. Later that evening, I walked out of the ballroom beneath a sky full of stars. No anger. No bitterness. No desire for revenge. Just peace. Behind me, a family was finally learning the value of humility. And ahead of me, a future brighter than anything I had ever imagined. As I reached my car, my phone buzzed. A message from the businessman appeared. "Ready for the next chapter, partner." I smiled, then typed back 3 simple words. "Absolutely. Let's begin." And with that, I drove away. Not as someone's ex-wife. Not as someone's mistake.